Hi, everyone. As you might know, I'm Becca Cantor, Jewish Book Council's editorial director, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the final meeting of Paper Brigade Short Story Club this year. As you also might know, Paper Brigade is Jewish Book Council's annual literary journal, and it celebrates the breadth and diversity of Jewish books today through a mix of articles, interviews, fiction, poetry, and artwork. At each meeting of our short story club, we discuss a work of fiction published in the journal together with its author. And today we are so pleased and honored to be joined by Gina Pfe-Mulligan, the author of Land and Milk and Honey. In addition to Gina, I'm joined by Paper Brigade's executive editor, Carol Kaufman, and fiction editor, Josh Rolnick. The three of us are going to kick off the first half of today's meeting with some questions for Gina, and then for the second half, we'll invite you to jump in. If you'd like to ask a question, which you can do at any point in the meeting, you can either raise your virtual hand or write your question in the chat. On the top right of your screen, you have the option of viewing the discussion in gallery or speaker mode, and I suggest switching to speaker mode if you haven't already done that. I'd also just like you to remind you to mute yourself when you're not speaking. If you'd like to read more of Paper Brigade, we're also posting a link to purchase the current issue. And just until midnight tonight, we're offering you $5 off with the code SHORTSTORY23. It's now my pleasure to introduce Carol Kaufman, Paper Brigade's executive editor. Carol was the primary editor of Land of Milk and Honey, and she will be leading today's conversation. Over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Becca, and welcome everybody to our final meeting for the season. Happy to see you again, Gina.
You too. Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure. I'd like you to start things off by summarizing the story for everybody in case they haven't read it yet.
Okay. Well, basically, The Land of Milk and Honey is about sex trafficking in the late 1800s. So it's an upbeat topic. It's really about two characters. It's a once trafficked prostitute named Sophia and the house runner whose name is Boris. And really, both are trying to get out of this house. You have a trafficked prostitute who's trying to earn her way out. And then you have Boris, who wants a promotion out of the Jewish syndicate run house. He wants to be moved up. And to do that, they have to trust each other and work together. And of course, one of the questions is, can you trust someone in that environment? And I'm not sure the story goes into some of that, but we're talking about, two characters trying to work together in a situation that's really fairly dire.
What inspired you to write this story?
Oh, it's interesting. I stumbled on trafficking in Jewish perspective when I was doing research for other pieces. I'm interested in Jewish history and in Jewish women's history in particular. And when I stumbled across trafficking in a Jewish world, that Jews were being trafficked, kind of stuck. I can't say I was fascinated by it since it's such a dark topic, but it certainly was one that felt like it hadn't been explored. And because I had stumbled on it, it was my place to at least take a look and delve more into this topic.
Would you please read a brief excerpt from the story to set things up and give our audience a flavor of it?
Yeah, maybe just a brief opening. Okay, Land and Milk and Honey. There were rules. According to the cadets, discipline kept their girls in line and was key to running a profitable house for the New York syndicate. The girls obeyed, and not only for fear of punishment. Nafkas, filthy whores, couldn't gaze in fancy store windows, watch a theater show or a children's clown. They didn't go to the dentist. Best to follow instructions, distract themselves from pointless desires. Mother's lasagna, goulash, schnitzel, baklava, a husband, breastfeeding a newborn. These longings swelled, too painful to touch. Best to forget, to focus on the mundane, to help push away the unwanted thoughts.
Oh, thank you. It's a great opening.
Thank you.
I imagine when I hear it again, that human trafficking and prostitution must have been very difficult subjects to engage with on a deep level. Were there any aspects of this scene that gave you or any of the women that you studied hope?
There was, and there's one really key aspect, and I think was also part of the inspiration for the story, is when I was doing the research, I found out that a lot of the Jewish women that were trafficked banded together to form their own hever kadishas. So that's the societies that do the special burial cleansing and burial ceremonies. And what was so moving and so important to me was, in this awful environment, any money they could put together and save, whatever that was, or trinkets they found in the street, they didn't use it to get out. They used it for this Jewish burial ceremony to make sure that the women were cleansed properly and could go on to, in their perspective, a better life. The life here was terrible, but it was going to be okay for the next world. And I just thought, just the deep Jewish belief and foundation to be able to do that was so incredibly moving. I find it so much a part of the story that I wanted to honor these women. And that was uplifting in its way, that in this darkness, this dark time, there's this light of Judaism that was so strong among these women. And that really did kept me going, has kept me going through this project.
It was a huge mitzvah.
Huge mitzvah, yes.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned I had a chance to do one, and it really is a very moving experience.
It's one of the mitzvahs that the recipient can't thank you for or
right.
reciprocate.
Right. And again, to think of that in a situation where life is so dark, that light was so important. And these cemeteries are still there. If you go look for them, you'll find them, and what the Jewish women are buried properly.
Wow. So in contrast to that, a huge theme that runs through the story is the issue of trust, as you mentioned when you introduced the story, and trustworthiness. And there's a certain phrase near the end of the story that stands out for me when Sophia realizes that she'd made a gentleman's agreement without any gentleman. So true. And also, when you look closely at the story, you realize that every other character has done that as well.
Yeah.
What are you saying in approaching the subject of trust and lack thereof?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I think it kind of started with the idea of trafficking. I mean, women are trafficked then as they are now in the same way. It starts with having to trust someone. You trust that the job they're telling you to be an au pair or a housekeeper is real. And that's where a lot of the trafficking is done. It's through someone who you believe and trust, family members, uncles, cousins. There's work, there's something that you're going to do that's legitimate. And that's often how women are trafficked. And so trust is just at the beginning of all of this, in this trafficking world. And then when you go moving into the story, I started to think, well, we don't live in a world where we don't trust people around us. What would that be like? I mean, how do you survive when you can't trust anyone and they can't trust you? And so I think there was a sense of trying to answer that question, which is a difficult one when you're not in that situation, but thinking it from their perspective and then throwing these characters in to make them have to trust each other or work together, I think makes a good story. But also I think it reflects, hopefully, some of the situation and the kind of the darkness of the situation beyond the acts we know and we think about in prostitution. There's so much more to it for women. And it's not just about the act itself. It is that lack of trust. It is about the circumstance they find themselves in. Many of them, when I researched, have a lot of self-hatred and guilt for being susceptible and and trusting someone they shouldn't. So there's a lot of layers when you think about trust.
Especially think of someone like the main character, Sophia, who becomes a procurer.
Becomes a procurer, yes. And that's the other part of the aspect. So in ways, and to help get herself out, she has to help traffic other women. And so can you forgive yourself for that? Is that self-preservation, or is that going beyond? That's a tough question. And she's trafficked in a story at the age of 12, which is based on a real story I read about.
In speaking to you, I know that Land of Milk and Honey is part of a longer piece of fiction, a novel. And I think all of us would love to hear a bit about that, and also explain the significance of the title, which
yes. Well, so the novel, I'm excited about the novel because it's been such a passion project. The novel is called The Petticoat Inspectors, and it's really based on a couple things. In 1903, there were the first female immigration inspectors that worked in Ellis Island. So there were 5 women that were kind of picked out to be a trial. And they were hired to look for women who were traveling alone, assuming that a woman who was traveling alone, who didn't have a husband or a family member or a job waiting for them in America, would somehow fall into prostitution, fall into bad times. And of course, what they discovered was they were not traveling alone, they were being trafficked. So they were with somebody. So that's the first piece of the story. So it's a Jewish young woman. Her name is Sarah, who is one of these inspectors who's hired to look for this and stumbles on trafficking. The men she worked alongside, the other inspectors, did not like women doing this job. It's 1903. And so they called them petticoat inspectors as a derogatory term. So that's one part of the story. The other part is Sophia, and this character is part of the main novel. And she is this trafficked woman who's now running a brothel, who is working, trying to get herself out. And what they do as part of their program in this brothel, and it's a Jewish woman, they have her Kadisha. And so they do perform the Tahara ceremony within the book. And in that process, they have to make sure that the body is cleansed properly, and they put on the pristine, very inspected garments, which in 1903 would include a petticoat. So the petticoat inspectors are the 2 main characters. And the story really revolves around these 2 very different women who cross over into each other's worlds and have to answer that question of, getting each other out. What can we do to help? What is our role as women to help other women? And I really have loved this project. And my hope is that even though it's historical, the similarities of what's happening today really do come through.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating.
It's very interesting research. Very interesting research.
I can imagine. I can barely imagine. Before I turn it over to Becca and Josh to ask a couple questions, I want to remind the audience to put your questions in the chat. And after Becca and Josh ask some questions, we will be able to take the questions from the audience. Becca, turning it over to you.
Sorry, just realized I was muted. Thank you, Carol and Gina. That's just so fascinating, all of it. I wanted to actually touch on, I know that when we spoke before, you'd also said some other aspects of your research, which I just found really fascinating. I mean, you spoke about, like just now you're mentioning how, there was these certain narratives that were created around prostitution, like, oh, she fell into prostitution, as if, blaming the women for this rather than admitting that it was this whole, no, there was a whole systematic way that they were sort of forced into this. And I wondered if you could also talk about the narratives. I know you described that there are narratives around Jews in particular as being responsible for this human trafficking as well. So I wondered if you could talk more about that. And then I also just wondered how that both of those different narratives around this type of thing sort of we see them now, how did they sort of become passed down, and how do we see them now? So if you have any thoughts on that. So
well, I think what was interesting in the research, and specifically in the 1900s, you start to have access to articles, and the New York Times specifically is where I did a lot of research. And what I found early on was this reference to white slavery, what they called it, first of all, and trafficking in the sense that look what the Jews were doing. The Jews were having systematic, like you mentioned, syndicates, they called them, kind of like the mob. And they were sending these young men back to the shtetls to traffic their own women. And there was report after report of Jews trafficking their own. And I started to get really upset because, first of all, it's so personal to sound that it's Jewish. And what do you mean that's all it's doing? And as I'm doing more research, I stumbled on a dissertation by a young woman who did a dissertation for a PhD project exploring this. And what she discovered was that it was less than 3% of the Jews in this brothel prostitution world were doing this. Less than 3% of all of the trafficking was Jewish. Other syndicates existed. The biggest share was actually Asian communities, Chinese, Japanese, but there were other factions all throughout New York and the Lower East Side. They were all doing the same. They were sending these charismatic men back to areas that were very poor, where women were very kind of, easily persuaded to be brought to America. I mean, that was a big, right? The big land of milk and honey, which is from the title. And so the fact that it was so anti-Semitic and that look what these bad Jews are doing really kind of is part of the book, actually. And it was part of such a narrative that was so false. And as you mentioned, women kind of falling into this. There were women who chose to be prostitutes because it paid well, but they chose that profession, like you've seen throughout, all humanity. So it's not, the narrative has been false. And that's, I think, one of my purposes for the book is to make sure it's clear that it wasn't just a Jewish problem, and it was a global problem. Going on now and what's going on today, women are trafficked in the same way, which is kind of a interesting and sad commentary. It hasn't changed. But I think one of the pieces for me that I stumbled on, I think that has changed is the organizations. Even in 1903, just so everyone knows, the Jewish women were very organized. There were already Jewish women's groups fighting this, both here and overseas in Eastern Europe, especially. So the women were already organized, and they did work with the Christian groups actually to band together to fight the trafficking. Today, we see the same thing. I stumbled across a group called the Soap Project, and it was started by a woman who had been trafficked. And what they do is in motels around sporting events, typically, are where a lot of trafficking happens and a lot of interactions happen. And so they put little cards in the soaps because the bathroom is the only place the woman is by themselves. And so these little cards have information that they can take with them, a phone number they can call, not 911, but a number that would get somebody to come to them immediately and come pick them up, who knows their situation, who knows the emotional trauma that's going on. And I just find that fascinating and amazing and heartwarming that women who have been trafficked are banding together to help other women. And it is a national project, I found out. I met them in Fresno, but they are a national organization called the SOAP Project. So if anyone's interested in donating or looking into it more, it really is an amazing organization.
What's the name of it so we can perhaps put it in the chat? Or
it's called the SOAP Project. And you can look at that. Yes, the SOAP Project is the full name.
SOAP Project.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Gina. That was, wow. Yeah. Incredible.
It's such a dark topic, and I know it's hard sometimes to talk about, but there's a lot of light within darkness, and I think we can find it in these kind of programs, in the things like the Heber Kadishas and what women actually have done and are doing now to help themselves and to help others.
It's fantastic.
Should I jump in here? Okay.
Sure, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, Gina, thank you. It's amazing to hear some of the story behind the story. There are a few questions coming up in chat, and so I actually have two questions. I'll try to get to them quickly. And one relates to what you just said about the darkness. Stu asked a question in the chat, sort of why did we take this story? And one of the reasons, at least for me as fiction editor, is that there's this incredible thing that happens with Sophia, the main character. And that is that Carol mentioned she's procuring other women. And we find ourselves, at least I did as a reader, on some level rooting for her in this horrible action because we want her to get free. We care about her. And I wonder how you think about that sort of delicate dance as a writer, how you think about your reader encountering that. There's a lot of complexity there. How do you approach that as a writer?
Oh, there is a lot of complexity, and it is a challenge. I think it's such a balance for me, because at one hand, you're writing a character, and I want someone to care about this character until you're focused on the one character. The other piece for me is I know this is based on real situations. So I think the only way I can kind of balance it is to say that if we can at least shine the light on one character to represent the positive of all of that world, then that's the best I can do. I think as a writer, as a story, you have to care about the characters, and they are real people. And that's what I think I came across in reading all these stories about the real people. They were good, they were bad, they had their ups and downs. They were just human beings. The same goes for Boris. He's not some just evil, flat person. He's a real person. He has his own issues, his own background, his own reasons for what he's done. And it's not so cut and dry. And I think there's a lot of gray, but it is a challenge. And at the end of the day, I do hope people at least can walk away from the story and feel like that they've learned something to go investigate for today. And again, I go back to that because I think for me, the book and the story were both about what's happening today. It's not just about historical issues.
Amazing. Yeah. And all of this helps to humanize them as you mentioned, right? Yeah. Boris has his own wants and yearnings as well. Just very quickly, and again, this I think is another reason that the story really drew us in. I'm a writing teacher also, and I'm always interested in craft. And I love what John Gardner says about sort of the importance of weaving a continuous dream in fiction. And the way we do that is with concrete details. And the details in your story are so beautiful and sometimes just absolutely arresting. I think about there's a door that locked from the inside that she noted that detail. You can smell the cigar smoke, the lemon cologne. I love the woman that they're trying to procure had eyebrows the color of pumpkins. Everywhere we go, the story is populated by these incredible sensory details. There was a question in the chat about your process. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how you think about evoking this world, how you come up with these details, and how you refine them.
Well, yeah, some of the details are real, not all of them. I think for me as a process, I tend to write a little bit more, I won't say the generic, but more the outline and go back and fill in the details. I don't do the details necessarily first unless they just pop into my head, because especially for this world, it did take kind of sitting back and thinking about, okay, what would this room look like? What would this feel like? For example, the lock, not having a lock on the door. That's not a detail I read, but you could imagine that. So the process is one of layering for me. And I think for a lot of writers, you start out with kind of this shell of what you want to tell, and then you go back. And I also try to focus on some of the sensory details because it's such a sensory world that they lived in. It's very tactile. There was a lot of abuse, a lot of touching, a lot of physicality in the rooms. The environment itself was very, just like I said, very tactile. So I focused on a lot of those I felt would invoke what I was feeling when I read these real stories. But it just takes time. I think writing, if people who want to write this, it takes time and layers and thinking and stopping and then refining and then taking things out. I know for me in historical fiction, you put too much in and then you got to take some stuff back out.
Thank you so much.
Just to clarify, somebody asked whether the Petticoat Inspector, it was Joanne Moss, thank you. The Petticoat Inspectors is out yet, and
no, not yet. It's not quite finished yet. But that said, I will do a shameless plug. I do have a website, GinaMulligan.com, not my hyphenated name, it's too long, GinaMulligan.com. I will be letting people know if you want to go there about getting some test readers. I would love to have some test readers for the Petticoat Inspector. I'm trying to do some really kind of some little bit of reading of some of the Jewish pieces for Jewish readers versus non-Jewish readers. So if anyone's interested in reading a little preview, let me know, and you can go on my website and let me know from there. Yeah, it's been interesting because it's a Jewish topic. You don't know yet. I'm working with some people from England, and it's interesting what they don't know, like just everyday Jewish words we know, like bagel. It's just interesting what people don't know. So it'd be fun to see that. Yeah, Cholent. Oh, forget it though. That's no.
One question from our audience from Miriam Abraham is, she finds it like amazing, hard to believe that the girls' parents would fall for this and send them off.
Well, in the story I'm writing, the main story, which is a very common one, is these men would show up and actually marry the woman. So they were sending off a young married daughter. So they were going to America. These were Jewish men who came and presented themselves and said, you know what? I'm from America. The women there are too modern. I want a good, wholesome shtetl girl who knows how to make cholent. And I'm going to take her back and I'm going to send for the rest of the family. And so this was a match. This was exciting. They thought this was it. This was, going to be how they were going to save themselves and their family from very poor situations. So they sent their daughters off with good conscience, thinking they're married to a nice, respectable young man. And they did use young men who were very respectable in appearance. And that is part of the novel. And that's a story I read over and over again. The other piece was they sent off young women thinking they had really good jobs. And that happens today. And I saw a documentary on Netflix about a woman who was a trafficker who said she was recruiting for housekeepers. And so they were sent off thinking they're going to a job not very far away. So it's on the surface, it does sound like, oh, I would never do that. And yet when you start to dig in a little deeper, you realize, again, issues of trust. But on the surface, it sounds very legitimate.
And being 12 years old or 13-year-old was not unusual?
Not unusual in 1903, not from the shtetls. They were married at 13 and 14 and 15, so it was not that unusual. It's a different era. And that is one of the challenges of writing historical fiction is trying to not put our own perception of the world as our modern perceptions on the historical elements and making sure and bringing that out, because in that time, that was acceptable. I have a great-great-grandmother who was married at 13.
Patricia Boyd asks, did Boris's wife know what he was doing? She didn't finish reading the story, and I feel like to tell the answer to that would be a big spoiler. But
spoiler? I think I'll have to. Yeah, that's a spoiler one. I hate to tell that one. You have another question?
I do see one in the chat, which I think is fascinating. I believe it's Mark Cohen asked, how did you go from, working on the whole novel? How did you manage to condense all that as a short story? Or how did you pull a short story from the whole?
The whole story wasn't finished yet, which helps. But I think the piece about the trafficking is not as elaborate in the novel. It's more elaborate here. But I think it's such a powerful piece that it needed to stand alone. And I am still playing with how much I put in the novel, so who knows what's going to happen. But the trafficking piece, women trafficking other women, for me was a big revelation. And I think that's why it kind of called to me to have its own standout piece in a short story. It's a strong motivator to have to do that to somebody else. And in the short story and in the novel, the big question is, can she forgive herself for doing this? I mean, can you live with yourself? This woman is now doing Hever Kadishas and cleansing women for the next life, but she doesn't think she's worthy of that. But why would she? Because she knows what she's done. And so those pieces of the element are all kind of woven together, I think, for the bigger story of this life that, and again, going back to this falling into prostitution, they were coerced, but it could be any of us. It could be anyone. These two characters in the book are interchangeable in a lot of ways because it could happen to either one based on circumstance. These were poor women. They didn't do anything wrong. They happened to be born at a time in a place that were poor. It's happening today in poor countries. And so, that piece of, for me, was again a powerful piece that I wanted to pull out and do something with and explore more.
It's fascinating.
And of course, women are often the spoils of war.
Yes. Yes, and this does not cover that in this novel. That's another day. But yes, so there's so many layers, and that's where it's hard. I think it's harder to focus sometimes because when you research, you find so much information, and then what can you use and layer in, and what really needs to get set aside for the next book or some other project.
And it's a tough balance because so much history and historical fiction seems too crammed with every shred of fact and bit of ephemera or whatever packed
That's
in.
because we get all excited. We get all excited because we find it so fascinating. It really does. You tend to. I know a lot of historical writers, and we throw all the stuff in, and we start to pull it out. So it's just knowledge we have now.
Josh, I think you had another question.
It was related. Again, I'm interested in this as a teacher from the craft perspective. So often, first drafts of novels that are or short stories that are so reliant on the actual record. I mean, you're so deeply imbued with the story of what actually happened. When you go to write that, it's not just the amount of facts or the details. It's that it doesn't come out feeling alive. It feels more like journalism or like reportage. So how do you avoid that? What is your process for sort of, because there's such there's something that feels so alive about this story on the page. Doesn't feel like you forget that there's a historical record. That's of course there, but it very quickly fades into the background. So how do you think about that? Do you leave distance, for example, from the time you're doing research to the time you start writing? What techniques do you use to avoid that problem?
Well, one of the techniques I have is I'm blessed with a very bad memory. So I will do all this research and I highlight and make all these notes, and I'll sit down to write, and a lot of details I forget, which I think is actually very helpful for this because it does give me distance automatically. It's like I know it was something about that, but I don't go back and look it up. I let myself just tell a story first, knowing I can go back and fill things in where I need to. And I do think that has helped. I would call it age, but I've always been that way. And so I think that for me, it's about the character. It's about trying to build the story. And if you try to stick too close to some of the history, it does kind of pin you in for the story too. So there's this an element of stepping back and saying, okay, first of all, tell a story. Let's just get the story, and then we can go back and fill in. And it's looking for really the elements of history that can highlight what you're talking about, that are part of the story in kind of an enmeshed way, that are not reporting. And that sometimes just takes editing, and sometimes you think you have it and you don't. But I do research kind of the bigger pictures. I do the writing, and then I go back and research details if I need to fill some more things in. I go look things up. But I do think the original research sets the tone for me, because I can't remember all the details. I get kind of just a good overview of tone and can write the story from that tone.
I love that idea of forgetting. It reminds me of Robert Olen Butler, a novelist, talks about how he was in the Vietnam War and he came back right after Vietnam and wrote a big book. And by his own telling, he remembered too much. The details got in the way of the fiction. And then more than a decade later, he forgot a lot of it, but wrote it with the impression. And that book became a short story collection called Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, which won the Pulitzer Prize. But again, it's about sort of forgetting even the details we experience can help us. So that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Gina.
Oh, yeah. And conversely, what's interesting, I've always found interesting, is that you can have some really great details that you put in that are real and people think they're fake. They don't believe. For example, the term unfriending, which I would never use in a historical novel, was actually from the 1700s. It means just what it means today. I was going to unfriend somebody. It's a very common saying, but if I put that in a novel now, they would not believe that was real. They would think it's too modern. So you have to watch it from both ways. You can actually, include things people don't believe are real when you really want to put that in there. So interesting.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I can't thank you enough for being here with us and what you've put into it. I'm going to hand it back to Becca to wrap things up and wish you all a good summer. Becca?
Thanks so much, Carol, and thank you so much, Gina. This was absolutely fascinating. If you enjoyed today's conversation, and if you'd like to read more of Paper Brigade, we are posting the link to purchase it and the discount code again. Our mission at Jewish Book Council is to educate and enrich the community through Jewish literature. We're a small nonprofit, and support from readers like you is crucial to our initiatives. And so I'd just like to encourage you to support us by becoming a JBC member. As I mentioned, this is the last Short Story Club meeting of this year. I noticed that some of you asked in the chat when the next season will come back. Don't worry, we will have a new season next spring. In the meantime, those of you who are in New York are actually warmly invited to a JBC event on Thursday evening, which you'll also find in the chat. And I hope the rest of you and those also in New York will stay tuned for more JBC events on the horizon. Thank you again. It's been such a pleasure to have you join us over the past months, and I hope you have a wonderful summer.
Thank you, Becca.
Everyone. Thanks, Gina.
Thank you,
guys.
Gina.
Thank you so much for everything.